the children and families based on their level of risk and need, and this is assessed through a comprehensive risk assessment prior to them beginning service. So at our site in Toronto, we serve over 200 families that take part in the SNAP Under 12 program, and that includes both the boys and the girls. Like I said, they're aged between 6 and 11, but our mean age is about 8.5. We do try and split them up into age brackets so they can have that peer support when they go through the group components, as that's a really important part in learning the SNAP strategy. The main referrals come from schools at the moment, but we do also receive referrals from police, child welfare, and also from parents themselves. So what happens when a child or family has been referred to us? Clinicians complete a comprehensive risk and need assessment, and we have a quite extensive measures batteries that we give to the parents for treatment evaluation that we do throughout their treatment. Based on the assessment, the initial assessment, they receive the targeted SNAP treatment, and as I mentioned, the children that requires continued care continue to be in our care after the program, and we do continued risk evaluation throughout their treatment. So the kids that we see that start the program present quite high learning problems, and that's because we have a pretty high threshold for including them into our clinical program. They need to be in the top 2% based on the child behavior checklist, the CBCL. So the numbers that you see in the brackets here represent the percentage of boys and girls that display these particular symptoms in the program. So you can see almost all of our children are really high on arguing, breaking rules, and being disobedient. But you also see quite a lot of more severe problem behaviors. And it's interesting to note that you don't see all that much difference between the boys and the girls in our program. So the girls do show very high problem behaviors as well. Okay, so I'm giving you a brief background to our model. So now I want to continue talking a little bit about the SNAP technique and how this technique that we use with the kids. So this is a basic thing that happens to everyone, right? Something happens that triggers you and makes you feel angry or frustrated, and you also feel that in your body might tense up. Your heart starts racing, or you might start sweating. And when you feel that way, this is the time to use SNAP. So you can imagine SNAP as coming to a stoplight, and when you're feeling angry and your heart's racing, we teach the children and their caregivers to use stops. And stops are things that will calm your body down, like taking deep breaths or counting to 10. And once they've calmed themselves down a little bit, we ask them to identify their negative or hard thoughts, as we call them, that are things like, I want to hit him or I want to kill him, and try and exchange those thoughts for more helpful or realistic thoughts like, I can handle this. And once they're in that stage, they're able to pick a good plan of action that's not going to hurt themselves or anyone else, and make them feel good about it, at the same time keeping their problems smaller rather than bigger, which they would be if they come slowly. So that's a very simplified version of the SNAP technique that we use. So I want to highlight this to you in an exercise that most people can relate with. So I'm going to read this out to you. So imagine that you and your partner are expecting dinner guests this evening. You both agreed that they would make sure that the house was tidy and dinner started by the time you came home from work. When you come in the door, the house hasn't been cleaned up and the dirty dishes are still in the sink from the night before. As far as you can see, dinner prep has not started at all and your guests are scheduled to arrive in 60 minutes. So if this happened to you and you walk in through this door, how would you be feeling? Anyone? Frustrated?
Anxious?
Panicked? Concern, right? And often people would feel anger and all these emotions, right? And what do you think might be happening to your body? We all have different body cues, as we call them. What are some examples you think if you came into this situation?
Blood pressure.
Right, you feel your heart starts racing, your blood pressure goes up. Right, shoulder gets tight, brow furrows. Yep, they're all body cues. And what might you be thinking when you see this?
Lots of profanity.
Yes, profanities. Anything else? Blaming, right. How can they do this to me? Or something like, they always do this. And that's what we call a hard thought and snap. And they're not necessarily always that helpful. Because if you acted on these hard thoughts and your feelings and your sensing of your body, you will most likely have an argument with your partner, and you wouldn't necessarily have an enjoyable evening, let alone actually solve the problem. So this is a good time to use your snap skills. So going back to the stoplight, you feel your body really tense and you're really angry and you're blaming your partner. What would you be doing to stop yourself in that moment, to calm yourself down? Because these are all very individual. Some suggestions? Yeah?
I would put my comfortable clothes on and get busy.
Right. Okay, so putting comfortable clothes on, that's a way of calming down, for sure. Any other suggestions? Turn on music? Yeah, that's a good way to calm down. Great. Anything like that, you're taking a deep breath, or sometimes taking a glass of water, anything to sort of stop that impulsive action that you want to do. Okay, so now we've calmed ourselves down, and we had our hard thoughts of, they always do this, I can't believe they did that. Then we want to try and exchange those for some more helpful, some more realistic and cooler thoughts. Any ideas of what you might be able to think personally if this happened to you? Yeah?
I would actually ask what happened. It's actually more important about what happened.
Right, so maybe they had a really busy day, or maybe something happened to them, sure. It can also be things like simple things like, well, maybe they didn't need to do that, or yeah, things like that. So now we have our cool thoughts and we calm down, we're able to make a better plan. So in this situation, what would be a good plan rather than having a massive argument? Go out for dinner. Right, just say, never mind, let's go out for dinner. Sure. Or like Andrea always says, just take takeaway, same thing. So now you have a good plan and you've kept your problem small, and you haven't had an argument with your partner, and everything can just go on smoothly. So that is the very simplified version of the snap technique. So congratulations, we've all successfully participated in this. Okay. So these strategies and these skills we try and instill into the group components and the individual and family-based sessions that we have with the families that we see. So like I said, it usually starts with a 13-week group component where we run separate groups for boys and girls and their parents. We only have maximum of 7 children in each group and 2 facilitators. So there's quite a lot of modeling and behavioral. Yes?
Can I ask a silly clarifying question? Are the parents separated by their child's gender too, or are all the parents in the same group?
Yeah, so we run boys and girls groups separately, and they're actually on separate evenings. So the parents would go to separate groups as well.
Sorry, are you asking if for a girls group, like her father is in that?
No, I just meant like, do the girls' parents in one group and the boys' parents in the other group?
We have 1 session a week, and they're 90 minutes. So the strategy that you've just experienced as well, we try and incorporate into different topics, and these are real life scenarios that are important for the children and families, and they include such things like dealing with anger or joining in, learning how to apologize appropriately, dealing with bullying, and generally avoiding trouble. So when we work with children and caregivers, it's important to use real life examples. So we often also ask them, has anything happened this past week that where you used just now, or you could have used just now? And we use that that situation and include the whole group in that. And the most impactful way to learn these skills is through modeling and role play. And modeling, it's simply the fact that repetition and seeing and then doing over a repeated number of times increases your skill acquisition. And doing role plays also elicits that emotional arousal that you need to make it feel real, like an everyday life. So what happens is that the facilitators will role play a scenario, and then we ask the children or the parents in the parent group to role play that same scenario. And in the meantime, the other children are asked to keep out for the triggers, the hard thoughts, the body cues, and then what would be their stops, their cool thoughts, and their plan. So by doing this and by being aware of everything that's going on and participating in each of the steps, the hope is that these skills will become automatic, so that in a real life situation, something happens, they go angry, they know that they should use the snap straight away. So it's using that in that moment. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Andrea, who's going to talk about the research part.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
You showed the boy schedule. Would the girl schedule be similar?
It is slightly different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you happen to have that?
You don't have that slide here. I can find it. Well,
So thanks again for having us today. This is actually my first opportunity to talk on behalf of my team, so I'm very excited to be here. So just briefly, this is an overview of some of the things that I'll be covering today. So I'm going to start by touching on what a scientist practitioner framework actually looks like for us day to day and within our work, as well how we're able to tailor individual treatment by level of risk and need, which Areti already mentioned. I'm then going to cover just a few key studies that pertain to outcomes and mechanisms of SNAP treatment. And then to conclude, I'll talk a little bit about some of the current projects that we're working on. So as already mentioned, SNAP treatment components and service delivery are always tailored to individual needs. And that's because the program is actually informed by a risk needs responsivity framework. So some of the components are listed here, and they do include the 13-week core program, as well as individual counseling, ongoing family support, as well as academic tutoring, and that's all given on a per needs basis. So treatment plans are always tailored, as I mentioned, and this is done with a combination of standardized measures, as well as assessment tools and the clinical judgments and expertise of the caseworkers who are working directly with our children and families. So, as a member of the CBI research team, part of my job is actually to collect and analyze that individual level data. So I do this at multiple time points with each child. So we would start at pre, before SNAP, post, and then as well, again, at multiple follow-out time points. And so at each stage, I provide a clinical summary report. And if you can see, this is actually taken directly from one of our clinical files. So this is what our caseworkers would be looking at following one of those assessments. And you can see at pre that this particular boy has come in clinical ranges on things like thought problems, internalizing, externalizing, total problems. I like to point that out as well because I think it's very easy to conceptualize the externalizing problems that a lot of these kids are facing, but we actually do see a really high degree of comorbidity, and this is something that we definitely try to address across the course of treatment. So in this case, there's significant improvement on all of those scales, but important to point out as well that obviously that's sort of an idyllic situation, and you will at times see like unchanged or more problems. And for us, that is just sort of I guess a point that we know this is something that we need to take, and we're going to use it as part of our treatment plan moving forward. So it's something that just requires further attention. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce some of our peer-reviewed research. But before I do, it's important to note that this is really just kind of a very small piece of what's been done. We've had ongoing research for over 30 years, so it's involved over 23 studies at this point, and that's many, many researchers, stakeholders, and collaborative partners. So actually 15 of these studies have been collaborative projects with affiliate sites who offer SNAP across our international communities. Obviously I won't be able to cover all of this today, so we'll just focus on a few.
Very cute.
Go back online. Sorry.
Would it be possible to have the AV presentation?
It might just be a case of
Brief review. Okay. Great. All right, so this is just a quick visual to highlight some of the different outcomes that we've observed following SNAP treatment across many contexts over the years. So these may not come as a surprise for many in the room, though I think that it is worth pointing out that in addition to, as I mentioned before, the expected decreases in externalizing behaviors like aggression and rule breaking, we often see concurrent decreases in things like depression and anxiety. And I think that this really helps to highlight, again, the comorbidity of the issues that these children are facing, and the importance of work that really helps to address the multifaceted nature of their challenges. Okay, so the first study that I'm going to talk about was actually published by a couple of researchers by the name of Burke and Lober in 2015. So they were conducting research with a large number of boys who had received SNAP treatment at a site in Pittsburgh, actually. So the study was a randomized controlled trial. It included 252 boys, average age 8.5. 76% of the sample is African American, with many falling into a low income bracket. And at this point, nearly 14% had already had some form of police contact. So it's very important to note that in order to be eligible for this study, participants... So sorry, guys. It's okay, you guys don't mind my notes, right?
Do you have any questions in the meantime? Yes?
I'm wondering how these programs are typically funded in communities.
Right, that is a good question. So the boys program that we have is almost entirely funded by the government, the Ontario government, and the girls program is I think 70% funded by the government, or the majority is funded, but there's also a lot of private donation that goes into that. Okay, back.
All right. So as I was saying, that in order to be eligible for the study, participants had to have an IQ above 70, as well as a qualifying score on a standardized parent or teacher report behavior measure. And then the outcome measures that they looked at were the child behavior checklist, which I'm going to get to just on the next slide. We'll look at some of those results, as well as the child symptom inventory 4. Okay, so before I get into this, the figure actually shows data that was collected at baseline prior to the 13-week group component, and then again at 3, 6, and 15 months following treatment. So those who received SNAP are represented by the dark gray line, and those who received standard services are in light gray. I've actually just included the red lines on the graphs here so that you can see where the clinical cutoffs on this measure are. So any scores falling above that red line are going to put them in that top 2% of behavioral scores. So what you can actually see here is obviously significant decreases across all of these scales. So aggressive behavior, rule breaking, conduct problem behavior, as well as what's known as an externalizing composite score. But what's interesting is that SNAP showed significantly greater reductions than youth and standard services on all of those scales with exception to rule breaking. And these positive treatment effects were actually maintained at a 15-month follow-up mark. So again, the treatment lasts for 13 weeks, so quite a significant gap in between the end of treatment and that last follow-up point there. So in a follow-up paper that actually used the same sample, these researchers used mediational modeling, and what they were interested in was looking at the mechanisms of SNAP treatment that were driving the effects that we just saw. So what they hypothesized was that there would be certain mediators that would be sort of more potent for SNAP services over standard services, and that these in turn would be driving the decreases in aggression that we just saw. So this is what they found, and these are all of the mechanisms listed in pink here. So these are what came up as significant. You've got pro-social behaviors, emotion regulation skills, positive parenting behaviors, and parental stress. But I guess what I'd like to say about this, though, is it doesn't necessarily negate the idea that there would be other factors at play behind the treatment success. This is really just what sort of sets SNAP apart from standardized services. So we think these might be some of the kind of key ingredients at work. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about a paper that used EEG. And they were interested in examining sort of the neural correlates of self-regulation in these kids pre and post-treatment. And specifically what they were interested in was an event-related potential called N2. So an event-related potential is really just a measured brain response that's the direct result of specific sensory, cognitive, or motor events. So in this case, we had 95 participants, the majority of whom again were boys between the ages of 8 and 12. So 71 of the children presented with clinical levels of externalizing problems and completed SNAP 13-week group component. However, actually half of these children were improvers following the 13-week component, while the other half did not significantly improve. And as well, there was a matched sample of 24 non-externalizing children. And this was just done for comparison's sake so that we could see sort of what a healthy N2 might look like in that population. And so as I had mentioned, they were interested in this N2, and that's because it's been linked with emotional processing in frontal regions of the brain. And they measured it in the context of a go, no-go task that was actually designed to require inhibitory control or self-control on the part of the child. So these two graphs, B is really just another visual representation of what we see in A. And what you're looking at is the 24 children, the matched comparison group, in black there. So that is kind of what we, as I said, would expect from a non-externalizing, healthy group of children. In blue and green, we have our externalizers. The green are the improvers, and the blue are the non-improvers. And again, we're looking at this pre-treatment and post-treatment. So you can see that the N2 event-related potential there, pre-treatment, is quite low compared to the comparison group. But following treatment, what we actually saw was an increase in N2, such that actually for those children who improved in SNAP, they were no longer significantly different from our controls. And what the researchers hypothesized about that result was that this actually might indicate a reduced need for cortical resources following programming. Okay, so now I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the projects that we're looking into at the moment. So the first is an external collaboration with CAMH, that's the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. So we're actually running a pilot study with them using a functional MRI. And the question that we'd really like to answer with that is whether or not SNAP treatment can increase functioning in areas that are associated with emotion recognition and self-control. The next is actually an internal project. This is going to be using structural MRI data. And again, what we'd like to know is whether or not we can predict SNAP treatment success by looking at surface structure of the brain prior to programming. As well, I had pointed out some of the anxiety pieces in our work, and at the moment we are examining some of our data around that comorbidity. So what we'd really like to know is how anxious and externalizing behaviors interact and how that is affecting the treatment response in the children that we see. And finally, we are actually just about to submit for publication this latent class analysis. And what we looked at was, we took a very large group of children from our site in Toronto who had received SNAP treatment. I think it was 800? 900. 900 kids. And what we're looking to see, I guess, is whether or not we can actually subtype those behaviors into meaningful categories that, again, would help us to fine-tune or tailor our treatment approaches. Okay, so this last bit, actually, unfortunately, my colleague Margaret Walsh, she's currently leading our SNAP expansion and implementation efforts, and she's not able to be here with us today. So bear with me. I'm going to do my best to touch on some of her current work, and we'll also do our best to answer your questions afterwards if there are any, and obviously direct people to the appropriate channels if you'd like more information. So we are currently scaling up across Canada, and this is being done through a venture philanthropy model with LEAP. So it involves partnering SNAP with smart money and industry experts, and we're hoping to produce massive social change. So our strategic partners include key players from government, corporations, foundations, as well as private investors. And we're obviously very grateful to be working with our founding partners on this undertaking. So we're about halfway through this 5-year plan. It involves scaling SNAP up to 100 sites in 140 communities with the goal of reaching 14,000 children. And this is just a kind of picture of where we're at the moment. So currently we have 46 sites in Canada. We actually also have 24 sites in the US, including 22 in Florida, 2 sites in the Netherlands, and 1 site in the UK. All right, so these are just some of our venture philanthropy partners. Obviously, we're very grateful to them for helping us out with this expansion and reaching 14,000 kids. And here's some of our contact info if anyone is interested in reaching out. Thank you very much for having us today.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sorry, yes, of course. He was mentioning that we have a girls growing up healthy group. However, at the moment, we don't offer a boys growing up healthy group. So this is something that actually at the moment is in the works because our programs were developed at different time points. The girls growing up healthy group was sort of tailored to the risk factors that we were looking at in terms of our risk assessments at that time. Right now, with respect to the boys, we do run something called an LIT group. It's a Leaders in Training. So once the boys have graduated out of our SNAP Under 12 program, they have the opportunity to participate in this Leaders in Training program. And so that brings together a group of, I think, between 12 and 15 boys. And it's kind of similar in that they have certain topics that they cover each week. We have male mentors in that group. They get an opportunity to do things like learn important life skills, cooking. There's homework and academic tutoring if they would like it. That's available. And yeah. Yeah.
Gentleman in front asked basically what was the rationale for separating the boys and girls and having them in two different groups. And it kind of speaks a little bit to the question we got earlier, and I got some of the topics that we have. So the topics do differ a little bit. The focus of the girls is a little bit more on the parent or caregiver-child relationship, interpersonal relationships. We're also able to have the girls, they're a little bit more focused, so during groups they're able to sit a longer time around a table and have more of a conversation, whereas with the boys it's very much up and go. We're changing the topics all the time and changing what they're doing to keep them more engaged. That has been a problem when the program used to be together before 1996. And the other rationale for it is, I guess, more on I think the girls, when we had them together, the girls weren't always so comfortable, and we're going under this feminist theory of having same-sex modeling as well. So we have female facilitators for the girls group, and not mixing that with the boys group, so they can feel more safe in a safe environment. Do you want to add anything to that?
Follow-up question, that is, how did you settle a feminist theory as a basis for doing this? Are there any alternative theories?
So the program is based on 5 theories. Feminist theory is one of them. And the reason for that, other than you only had to go into a girls program and a boys program to see that they're very different. And we don't have 100%, as you know from also hearing from throughout today and yesterday, the scientific backing. So my expertise is in sex differences, biological sex differences, and I know that in that area we still struggle a lot to find what's really are separating the boys and girls. But we also know clinically that they are different and they do present a bit different, and having this separation did increase treatment outcome. So you can see that from when they were together and when they were separated out.
Is this program like available to the native population, and if so, what's the response from that cultural perspective?
Yeah, I think you know a little bit more about that, maybe?
A little bit, yeah. Definitely this is something that Margaret would be able to speak to as well, because she's really been leading that side of our work. But at the moment, we are actually adapting a lot of our materials to be culturally responsive. And so as part of that, we've sort of paired with different organizations around the province and the country to develop materials and manuals that are meant for like different cultural groups. So that's involved, obviously, we're kind of there to facilitate that process. And so we bring our manuals, and they're quite flexible. They're able to be adapted, and we typically, we like to engage members from those communities to actually help us to drive that process forward.
I would imagine like your scores on some of your clinical scales would be different too, just depending on the adversities that those groups are facing.
Yeah, definitely.
So, you know, city group versus a rural native group, you can have a totally different.
I'd be inclined to agree with you. It's, again, still very preliminary, so we don't have a lot of that data yet, but we are working on it at the moment.
Hey, I just wanted a clarification on the feminist theory of single-sex modeling. So you said that the females or the girls are paired with female facilitators, is that right? And then are the males, or the boys paired with male facilitators?
Not always. There is a mix in that. I think that the backing is there for girls to have the same sex modeling. I'm not sure if there's the same scientific or logic backing in that for the boys. I'm not actually sure about that. I think, there's definitely a staffing issue, and I know especially going into the more rural communities, we find that we struggle with keeping that. When we implement SNAP in these smaller communities, they don't always have the resources to keep this same-sex modeling, so, but we try as much as we can to enforce that.
Given the findings of just starting this program and your experience has been focusing on age 6, has there been any thought to creating an additional model for ages 3 to 5?
Yeah, so within the agency that we're in, Child Development Institute, we have several services for ranging from infancy to much earlier childhood. And I'm not sure that we're not currently looking to do SNAP before those ages. And that has a lot to do with the literature around impulsivity and self-control. The ages sort of 6 and 11 is really when these processes start to develop in children, and it gives it the opportune time to intervene as well, when the kids are not maybe developing the processes to keep their impulses to themselves. And so that's really the time where it's the best time to do this type of intervention that targets self-control and impulsivity. And the other historical reason for this age group being the main group is, like I said, that it came about when the age of criminal responsibility was raised from 7 to 12, and all of a sudden there was this gap where children under 12 could do whatever they wanted, and before they were punished for it, and now they weren't, and they were often used by other people as a means of committing crime. So this program was really created to target that group, and we call it the forgotten group, or the group that didn't receive as much attention as the earlier years, and also the later years. When you come into adolescence, there's also much more programming out there. So that's it. Sorry, you had a
How do you screen for depression and anxiety? As perhaps connected to the addiction issue. So depression and anxiety, does that factor into your evaluations?
Yeah, so that's actually captured as part of the measures battery that we do with children, as well as the like clinical appointments and intakes that we would do with them. So as I mentioned, we have the child behavior checklist that we do, which includes measures of anxious and depressed symptomology. And then we would measure that again at post-program and follow-up timelines. Does that answer your question?
Well, then the question would be, how does that correlate with outcome? If they have higher indices of depression and anxiety on entry, that they go down over time, but how does it correlate with the outcome of the intervention?
That's interesting, we're looking at it.
Yeah, so that was one of the studies. If we can go up, let's try and there. So this is one of the big problems that we see. Children come in and they present with really high externalizing problems, and they come in with high levels of anxiety or depression. So first of all, if they have really high anxiety, we would divert them to an anxiety program perhaps first to deal with their level of anxiety and get that down before we will target their externalizing problems. And we're currently running this study to look at the how anxiety and aggression can interact to create for treatment outcome, basically. And these results basically back this up, that if a kid comes in with high externalizing but they're really high on anxiety, they're not going to benefit from a self-regulation program as much as if they had low anxiety. So I think it's really important that we deal with that first, so that they are open to increase the self-control.
So one of the slides, I think, one of your first slides was talking about the change, like roughly half changed and the other half didn't. Right?
Yeah.
So from the half that didn't, what interventions or what was done for those kids, right? In the seminar we had this morning, he was talking a lot about that, right?
Yeah.
Where you have these blanket approaches where it benefits maybe half, the other half gets no benefit or there's no observable change.
Yeah.
So what happens to those kids? Are they put into another program, or is there some other way of addressing the half that didn't get any benefit?
So first of all, those studies are on the 13-week group component. So they do continue in service, and often what we see, so externalizing problems are often those that get improved quicker. But it also, for some kids, it takes a lot longer. So we always follow them up way after the program to see, first of all, with the children that do improve, if these improvements are maintained, and the kids that don't, if they just might take a bit longer and they catch up in a few months or a year later, you will see that improvement. And for the kids that don't improve, that is a major research question for us right now. That is separating those kids. And so the study that Andrea mentioned there, the latent class analysis, is one piece of that puzzle to try and see, to look at the kids that didn't improve, what separates them from the ones that did improve. And we're looking at just the behavioral profiles at the moment. But we will sort of use, because we have so much data, we can really start to looking at what differentiates those children, and we're going to start trying to look at this from a neurobiological level as well. And yeah, so that will be the future. Yeah.
For an equal program, I think from ages 3 to 5, I think the Incredible Years, which is offered in Canada and the United States, worldwide also, the Incredible Years, and then when it comes to something very close to SNAP, like the actual Stop Now plan, the dinosaur school part of the Incredible Years is very much that. So I think a very equivalent for 3 to 5 would be the Incredible Years. Just to do something for that.
Yeah.
What happens when children reach the 11-year-old age and they're still struggling? Where do they go from there?
So the question was, what happens to the kids that come to age 11 and they're still struggling? So we would keep them in care. So they would go into one of our other programs or continue with components to keep working with them and their families up until they're discharged if they're better, or until they're 18 years old.
Okay.
What kind of dropout rate?
Dropout rate? That is a good question.
I know that it's quite low, but unfortunately I don't have the numbers with me at the moment.
You guys have a filtering system, like if somebody's hasn't been sober for more than 6 months, they can't enter the group program, or high dysfunction at home. You guys filter it?
We only filter, so if they have a learning disability, they are referred to other programs, or they have a severe developmental problems, they are referred to other programs. Other than that, not really much. We take on the kids that reach that level of high externalizing problems of either aggression, rule breaking, or a combination of those. In terms of the wait list, we do have a really long wait list, unfortunately, and that's part of our expansion at the moment to increase the number of sites that are running programs. Unfortunately, we have about a 2-year wait list just in our site. So we are really working on trying to increase that capacity, so to decrease that list. In fact, nobody wants that.
You may have shown it before, but do you have data about the ethnic disparity, or the ethnic backgrounds of the kids that you showed us data for?
Oh, we do, but not with us. Do you know more?
to be honest with you. I think especially as we're undertaking some of these projects around the expansion and around these cultural adaptations, that's become quite a big question for us. So it is something that we're looking at. I don't have the demographic data with me today, I'm sorry.
Just two questions about when you got to locals. Are some of those clients with potential families on the wait list, are they mandated by the court system since they're part of that as an intervention process? And do you triage at all those people in this family has a higher incidence of
Yeah, so we get children from a variety of referral sources. So some of them might be court mandated, others might be referred to us from child services. And then with respect to triaging, the only time that I'm aware, because again, like all of our kids that we see are typically in that top 2%, so at that point it's, I don't know, I think it's almost arbitrary to discriminate between them on that basis. But when we would sort of bump someone up the list is if we recognize that they're starting to approach that upper age limit, and so of course we wouldn't want them to miss out on programming. So if you're getting to that 11-year range, we would move them up the list, yeah.
And also if they are police referred, they get bumped as well.
I saw a slide that talked about the 15-month treatment outcomes were maintained, positive treatment outcomes. Is there more longitudinal data for
Yes, we definitely do have longitudinal data. So I'm trying to think in particular of which study I want to talk about because there's a number of them.
Yeah, we have a number of studies that are studies as well, in-house studies. They usually do tend to go to around 2 years, and then we have criminal record data, which I guess is a form of longitudinal, but that's. We don't have the sort of the 10-year follow-ups yet, unfortunately. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming today.